Sephardi Zionism. Now, both of those terms, both Sephardi and Zionism, and the way they sit together, all require a degree of unpacking. And we're going to do that this evening as a way of introducing this series and then jumping into the first subject of this topic, which is Iberian dreamers. Now, this requires a lot of unpacking, and I'll start with the word Zionism, because of course Zionism is a 19th century term in its origin. It reflects a political nationalist movement largely started by Theodor Herzl, and shall we say an organized way. And we spent a lot of time talking about the 19th century in another series where we spoke about the topic of the Jewish question that was debated and discussed among non-Jews and Jews during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And so the Zionist movement was, shall we say, a response to that question to say, well, we're going to provide the answer. That's going to be to give Jews the rights that all other nations have, which is a right to a national sovereignty, the right to have a national homeland where they can be the ones to determine their future without suffering from the persecutions of anti-Semitism as Jews had faced in what we call the diaspora. And so this movement was started to, shall we say, lay the groundwork, the foundations for Jewish, at first, autonomy somewhere, or at least ideally in the ancient land of Israel, and ultimately led to a movement that said it actually should be not just sovereignty, it should be independence. And that, of course, leads to the state of Israel. Now, normally when thinking about the topic of Zionism, one thinks of Ashkenazi European Jewry in Central as well as in Eastern Europe. And from that perspective, people often think of it in a very narrow kind of way of saying, this is a movement of some Jews, not all Jews, a very specific group of Jews. It's not the, shall we say, reflective of the Sephardi experience or of Jews in other places in the world. And as a result, I think there is, shall we say, a misunderstanding about not just what Zionism is, but really what are Jewish sensibilities and Jewish attitudes towards Israel, towards sovereignty, to Jewish life in the ancient Jewish homeland. And so, in a sense, saying Sephardi Zionism is a bit anachronistic, because it's a specific, shall we say, political movement, which is not, shall we say, founded by Sephardi Jews. But that really misses the point, because at its root, Zionism is an outgrowth of a many millennia old relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And while it became, shall we say, a modern nationalist movement in an organized way among Jews in Central and Eastern Europe in the 19th century, to, shall we say, limit it to those Jews in that specific movement, and in that moment, misses the point about the broader Jewish relationship to the land of Israel. And so, in a sense, the word Zionism is perhaps unhelpful when thinking about Jews and Israel, because if one defines it, shall we say, really tightly and narrowly, it really limits the breadth of that relationship. Though, of course, it's a very powerful term because it talks about this really important movement as well. And so there's been some discussions around, should the term Zionism simply be dropped because it's confusing, it's misconstruing, and at its root, there is just a profound connection between Jews and the land of Israel, and, shall we say, modern terms sometimes allow people to manipulate or kind of misunderstand the deeper kind of and broader significance. And so what I'd like to do in this series, by talking about Sephardi Zionism, is really talking about the relationship of Sephardi Jewry throughout the millennia in the broader sense of the relationship of Sephardi Jews to the land of Israel. And then as we move through the different, shall we say, lectures within this series, we'll end up talking about the actual intersection between Sephardi Jews and the political movement known as Zionism. And we'll see that they're not actually two entirely different movements, a movement that Sephardi Jews weren't part of, but in fact, Sephardi Jews did play a very important and central and key role even within the political 19th century movement known as Zionism. And so I think it's a great series, really interesting, and I hope will kind of provide another angle for the way that both Sephardi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and non-Jews understand this age-old relationship between worldwide Jewry and the land of Israel. And so let's kind of then talk about the other word. We spoke about the word Zionism. What about Sephardi? Well, when it comes to Sephardi, the way that that word has been understood by Jews for over the past millennia has been in association with the Iberian Peninsula, with Spain, not really quite Portugal, in the way that Portugal is a bit of a later. And without getting into the complexities of Spain, Spain itself was many different countries, as we'll see. But let's just talk about the Iberian Peninsula. And so you have the Jews who emigrate, obviously originating in the Middle East, eventually emigrating to other places around the world. Some Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, end up in Central, Northern, Eastern Europe, right? Italy, and then France and Germany, and ultimately places like Poland. And you have other Jews who find their way more crossing through the Mediterranean, maybe across North Africa, and eventually settling in the Iberian Peninsula. And that's the community that we think of when we think of, technically speaking, Sephardi Jews. Now, today, many Jews identify themselves as Sephardi, Jews who maybe live in other places or originate in other places separate from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula. And that's for a whole host of reasons, which are really interesting and really important, but perhaps are subject for a different series. For the purpose that I want to focus on, I want to talk about, shall we say, true Sfarad, or the original Sfarad, though it'll expand throughout the series, which is looking at Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula and its relationship to the Holy Land. Now, the part where this story, shall we say, begins is with a verse in the Hebrew Bible from Sefer Ovadia, where it says, Galut Yerushalayim asher bisfarad, that the exiles of Jerusalem that were in Sfarad. Now, historians have looked at this verse, commentaries have looked at this verse, and in its original meaning, it may have, shall we say, referred to another place, not Sfarad in terms of Spain, but the way it was understood, certainly over time by the Jews in Spain, is that it actually was referring to Sfarad, meaning Spain. And as a result, the Jews in Spain saw themselves or understood themselves to be the actual, shall we say, descendants of the Jews who had been in Jerusalem. And that's really important because, of course, in Jerusalem, not only is that where the Beit HaMikdash, where the temple was, but that's also where the kings were, right? That's where the monarchy was. And so there was this great sense of, shall we say, aristocracy that the Jews of Spain felt, that they were the creme de la creme, as it were, of world Jewry, that they were the exiles of Jerusalem, right? Not just of anywhere in Israel, but of the capital city. And so that's first and foremost, that there was, shall we say, this profound sense of connection that the Jews of Spain felt to the Holy Land, particularly to Yerushalayim, to the ancient capital city of Jerusalem. But what we'll see is that as we look at some of the key figures of, the heyday of Sephardi Jewry in, the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, is that we see that this idea or this understanding of what Israel means to the Jewish community even living in the diaspora becomes something, shall we say, deeply felt and something which is expanded upon. And so let's begin by talking about a halachic debate, a legal debate about what exactly is, technically speaking, the relationship between Torah and the mitzvot, the Jewish law, and its relationship, its commitment to the land of Israel. And this plays itself out in a debate between two of the most well-known Sephardi sages, that of Rambam, Maimonides, and Ramban. And here we find that the debate centers around, is there a technical obligation for a Jew to live in the Holy Land? Is it a mitzvah? And the way that this plays out is that Rambam went about, as did others, and trying to identify what is included in the 613 commandments. There's a tradition of the Talmud that says there are 613 commandments. So the question became, well, what are they? And as a result, there was this really interesting kind of exploration during medieval times for Jews, sages, to, shall we say, identify what is included in the 613. Amazingly, Rambam does not list Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the settling of the land of Israel, as a mitzvah. Now, this is picked up by Ramban, living in 13th century Gerona, where he says that, in fact, that lacking, that skipping within Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, his book of mitzvot, is actually inaccurate, because the commandment to settle the land of Israel is, in fact, an independent mitzvah, and specific obligation enjoined upon Jews in all places, all times, to settle the land of Israel. And he points this out in his commentary on the Rambam, where he identifies the areas where he disagrees with the Rambam's counting. And so this has led to a really interesting debate about, well, what is actually going on? Does Rambam not think there's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel? And different sages over the centuries have suggested different, shall we say, explanations. And it's rooted in the fact that Rambam quite clearly understands that there is some kind of imperative for Jews to live in the land of Israel. There's a whole host of laws that only apply in the land of Israel. And there seem to be, shall we say, certain assumptions in some of his areas of his Mishneh Torah, his code of Jewish law, that presume, shall we say, an assumption that there is this preference for living in the land of Israel. And so this has led some to suggest that, in fact, Rambam does think a mitzvah. He just, technically speaking, didn't see it as an independent mitzvah, but in fact it was subsumed among broader obligations. And so if there's other obligations that relate to the land of Israel, then the Rambam perhaps simply saw the commandment to live in Israel as, shall we say, part of those laws. So he just didn't include it as a separate mitzvah, but perhaps, in fact, he still does see it as a mitzvah, even in post-biblical times. Others have suggested, and this is, I think, the really interesting area to understand, is that he sees this not as a mitzvah. He doesn't see it as a mitzvah. In fact, there is no mitzvah to, according to Rambam, to live in Israel in the sense of the strict kind of laws, because that's referring to the specific laws as laid out at Mount Sinai. But if you take a step back and think about, shall we say, Israel within Jewish history, and you go back to the very beginning of the story with Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, right, with the forefathers, it's quite clear that the covenant, the brit, that God made with them all relates to living in the land of Israel, right? That's the that's the covenant he made, right? At the Brit Ben Habitarim and so on, right? That your descendants will inherit this land. And that's the, shall we say, the covenant that each of them passes down to their chosen child, right? To Yitzchak and to Yaakov and then to his children. And so you find within this, shall we say, this just clear, shall we say, foundational, obvious point that there is a deeply rooted, shall we say, relationship between Jews and Israel. And in a sense, it doesn't have to be even articulated then later as a mitzvah. It's clear that that is just the basis of the whole thing, that we are a nation that has a homeland, that has a connection to a particular place, and that is where we establish our sovereignty and ultimately, build the temple and have government, and where we live Jewish lives. And so it, shall we say, doesn't need to be articulated as a separate mitzvah because it's shall we say, it's even bigger than the mitzvah. It's a foundational, shall we say, pretext to the entire enterprise that there would be indeed the Jewish state in the land that God had promised to the forefathers. And that's a really interesting idea because that seems to, shall we say, play that attitude that there is this, shall we say, that it's an ikar almost, a guiding principle of Judaism, of Jews and the relationship to Israel, seems to be, shall we say, manifest in some of the other writings of Sephardi sages in Iberia, including Ramban, who we said identified it as a specific mitzvah, because Ramban has this almost like a crazy perspective that he writes in his commentary to the Torah, where he says the following. He says that when a Jew, shall we say, let me rephrase that a Jew is obligated to follow the mitzvot, the laws of the Torah, when they are living in the land of Israel. But when a Jew is not in the land of Israel, they are not obligated in the same way to fulfill those laws. And he uses as an explanation to explain why why the forefathers only observed certain things when they were in the land of Israel. When they were out of the land of Israel, they didn't. And again, without getting into the detail, the nitty gritty of that, he lands on this idea. Now, Ramban says you have to keep the mitzvot even when you're outside the land of Israel, but he frames it almost as if we do it so that we don't lose the Torah, but that ultimately or ideally the Torah is observed when we are living in the land of Israel. And so again, there's this thing that it's almost like all the mitzvot are predicated on the assumption that they are being fulfilled in the land of Israel, to the extent that when we're not a land of Israel, we're almost just maintaining it so that we can, in the future, keep it when we are in the land of Israel. And so there is, shall we say, this deeply held belief that shall we say, the foundational context of Judaism is rooted in a national identity, a national life in the land of Israel. The one who perhaps, shall we say, brought this forward in the most profound way or in the most emotive way is Yehuda HaLevi. Yehuda HaLevi, who lived in the 12th century. And he, of course, wrote beautiful poetry, some of which is sung on Tisha B'Av in some communities, Ale Tzion, right, the Ode to Zion. And he also explores it in his theological work, the Kuzari, where he sets forth this idea that the Jewish people, shall we say, are intrinsically rooted in the land of Israel. That in a sense, that is the place where the Jewish people are most apt to flourish. He frames it in a way that certain kinds of agriculture do best in certain climates. And if you plant that thing in a different climate, it may not flourish, or it may not even be able to take root. And so he says the Jewish people take root best in the Holy Land. That is where they're best able to flourish, and somehow in some kind of like spiritual sense. And shall we say that then manifests in this ode to Zion, right? This lamentation about, what is lost by not being in the land of Israel. And so this really kind of like passionate love affair for the land of Israel. And so you find among all of these really important Iberian Sephardi sages a deep understanding, a deep connection to the land of Israel that manifests in their discussions of halakha, of Jewish law, of Jewish thought, of Jewish spirituality, and of course in Jewish history and in their own sense of identity as being rooted there. But the thing that's amazing about them is that they didn't limit this, shall we say, to the conceptual. But all of these rabbis, at a certain stage, either in life or in life or ultimately in death, all found themselves returning to that ancient homeland. Yehuda Halevi makes his way there in the middle of the 12th century, and there's different traditions about it. Some say that he made his way there, and shall we say, in Jerusalem, at the gates of Jerusalem, he was murdered, and in a sense, that's where his story, shall we say, concludes. Others say he perhaps lived for a time there. There's, shall we say, not entire clarity around it. There's been really interesting information that's been brought forth from the Cairo Geniza, where letters have been found that have given some more nuance, that perhaps he was there and then left and then went back and so on. But that ultimately, that is where he, according to tradition, he died and ultimately was buried. So in a sense, he returned to this place that he, shall we say, had written about and shall we say, spoken about in such emotional and, in almost a place that had great love for him. You find the same thing then happening with Rambam. Rambam's family is forced to flee southern Spain during the 12th century. Ultimately, we know he settles in Egypt, but for a time seemingly went through Akko and was a bit there. And then there's this tradition that he's ultimately is buried in the land of Israel, in Tiberias, in Tiberia. And you can go visit a place there where, according to tradition, he was buried. And there's traditions that he was, shall we say, carried there by a camel, and that's where the camel stopped, so they knew that's where he should be buried, but that it was with a whole entourage, and that he too, shall we say, ultimately ends in the land of Israel. And Ramban is, shall we say, the most, shall we say, intentional of them all. Ramban, living in 13th century Catalonia, was forced to participate in a religious debate with Christians there. And then following the debate, he published his account of what happened, and that in fact his arguments had won the day. Well, as a result of doing that, he was charged with heresy and was forced to flee. And he ultimately flees to Israel. There's a whole host of, shall we say, debate around, theories around where exactly he ultimately was buried, but we know he was there and that he helped reorganize the Jewish people who were living there to help establish the community a bit more, a synagogue, the yeshivot, of course, is the synagogue in the Old City that we refer to as the Ramban synagogue. And so you find that all of these sages, wrote about Israel, thought about Israel, remembered Israel, but ultimately found a way to eventually return to Israel. And that's why I referred to this opening lecture as the Iberian Dreamers. Because far away from the land of Israel, all the way in Iberia, these people who saw themselves as the descendants of those who had been the aristocracy, the kings even, of the land of Israel, from the capital of Jerusalem, for them, Israel continued to play an important part of their personal beliefs and theology and ideology. And for them, it wasn't just some kind of conceptual, distant dream. It's something that, in a sense, they ultimately found a way to manifest into a reality, to turn their love into practice, into an actual return to the land of Israel. And so well before the Zionist movement of the 19th century, these Sephardi Jews were expressing and writing about and feeling connected to the land of Israel, and ultimately even moving to and ultimately living or dying in the land of Israel. And so with that, we'll conclude the first lecture in this series. And I look forward to speaking with you next week when we're going to explore the next stage within that story, when Jews, shall we say, en masse, leave Spain, and how that translates into a movement back east, as it were, and ultimately into the Holy Land. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to learning with you in the next class.